The culling chamber smelled like metal and fear. 5 dragon hatchlings pressed against each other in the corner, their eyes wide and confused. They were only 3 hours old, but they already knew something was wrong. Breeding Master Corvin walked around the containment pen with his assistant trailing behind. His scaled hands held a data tablet that listed each hatchling's defects in cold medical terms. One hatchling had a wing that never formed properly, twisted at an angle that would never allow flight. Another was barely half the size she should be, a genetic mistake that made her worthless for military service. The third had scales that refused to harden, leaving her vulnerable to any attack. The fourth could only produce weak smoke instead of the fire that made dragons valuable. The fifth was completely blind, her eyes clouded and useless. Process them within the hour, Corvin said to his assistant. Standard protocol for genetic failures. Document everything for the breeding records. His assistant nodded and made notes. Neither of them looked at the hatchlings as living creatures. They were failed products, nothing more. In Draconid society, only perfection deserved to exist. These 5 represented shame and wasted resources. David Reed heard the conversation through the half-open door. He had taken a wrong turn while hauling biological waste from another section of the facility. His cart was full of empty containers, and he just wanted to finish his work and get back to his ship. But something made him stop and listen. He pushed the door open wider and saw the hatchlings for the first time. They were small, no bigger than house cats, with soft scales that caught the harsh overhead lights. The smallest one tried to crawl toward the barrier that kept them contained. Her movements were clumsy, but determined. "What are you doing here?" Corvin's voice was sharp and annoyed. "This area is restricted to breeding facility personnel only." David stepped inside, his eyes still on the hatchlings. "What happens to them? That is none of your concern, human." Corvin turned back to his tablet, dismissing David with body language. "Leave immediately, or I will report you to station security." But David did not leave. He walked closer to the containment pen. The hatchlings noticed him. Instead of cowering away, they moved toward his side of the barrier. The blind one tilted her head, sensing his presence through sound and smell. The small one made a soft chirping noise. "They will be euthanized," the assistant said, apparently thinking David would leave faster if he got an answer. "It is the merciful thing to do. They cannot survive without constant care, and they serve no purpose. They are defective." David's jaw tightened. He had a younger sister back on Earth who was born with a heart condition. Without medical intervention, she would have died before her first birthday. But humans did not give up on their family just because they were born different. His sister was now a teacher with 2 kids of her own. What if someone wanted to take them? David asked quietly. Corvin looked up from his tablet, surprise flashing across his reptilian face. Then he laughed, a harsh sound that echoed in the sterile chamber. "No one wants such burdens. They will drain resources and die anyway despite any effort. They cannot fight, cannot work, cannot even feed themselves properly. They are less than worthless." "I will take them," David said. The room fell silent. Corvin stared at him as if David had just volunteered to jump into a star. His assistant's mouth hung open in shock. "You clearly do not understand what you are saying," Corvin said slowly. "1 defective dragon is a life sentence of difficulty. 5 is absolute madness. They will consume your credits, ruin any reputation you have, and die within days despite your efforts. I cannot allow you to—" "Can you stop me?" David interrupted. "Legally, I mean, if I signed the right paperwork." Corvin's eyes narrowed. He thought for a long moment, then gestured to his assistant. "Bring the release forms. If this fool wants to destroy his life, that is his choice." 20 minutes later, David stood in the corridor with a data pad full of signed waivers. He had officially taken possession of 5 dragon hatchlings with no commercial value. The Draconid Council had washed their hands of any responsibility. If the hatchlings died, no one would investigate. If they suffered, no one would care. In the eyes of the law, these creatures had ceased to exist the moment David took them. He loaded them in a modified cargo containers on his ship with help from a board-loading crew. The hatchlings were frightened by the handling, but they did not fight. They seemed to understand that David was trying to help them. As his ship prepared for departure, David visited the cargo bay one more time. The 5 containers were lined up against the wall, their transparent sides showing the small dragons inside. They looked impossibly fragile. The smallest one pressed her face against the container wall, looking directly at David even though she could not see him. The one with the twisted wing tried to spread it inside the cramped space. The others huddled together, seeking comfort from each other. David had no idea what he had just done. He knew nothing about raising dragons. He had no place to take them, no long-term plan, and no guarantee they would survive the week. He had just destroyed his simple life as a cargo hauler on impulse. But looking at those 5 small faces, he could not regret it. Someone had to care. Someone had to try. The ship's engines rumbled to life, and David strapped himself into the pilot's seat. His navigation computer showed a 6-day journey to Waypoint 7, a human-operated trade station where he could at least find temporary shelter points 6 days to figure out how to keep 5 impossible creatures alive. David took a deep breath and engaged the engines. Behind him in the cargo bay, the hatchlings felt the ship move. They were leaving the only place they had ever known, heading into an uncertain future with a strange alien who smelled like compassion and determination. The breeding facility grew smaller in the rear cameras until it disappeared completely. Corvin watched the departure from his office and made a final note in his log. Human collected refuse specimens. Expected survival time, less than 1 planetary rotation. He closed the file and moved on to inspect the next clutch of eggs. The 5 defective hatchlings were already forgotten, erased from official records as if they had never existed at all. The cargo bay was freezing at night and too hot during the day. David had never realized how difficult temperature control could be until he had 5 cold-blooded creatures depending on him. The hatchlings huddled together for warmth when the ship's systems cycled to night mode, and they panted with open mouths when the heating kicked in too strong. He named them on the 2nd day because calling them the small one or the blind one felt wrong. The hatchling with the twisted wing became Patch. The tiny one became Bit. The one with soft scales became Silk. The smoke breather became Ash. The blind one became Echo. Naming them made everything feel more real and more terrifying. Feeding them was a nightmare. David tried standard protein supplements first, the kind used for most reptilian species. All 5 hatchlings vomited within an hour. He tried raw meat from the ship's food stores. They ate it, but could not digest it properly. Their waste smelled toxic, and Silk developed a rash across her soft scales. On the 3rd day, David was ready to panic. The hatchlings were getting weaker. Bit barely moved from his corner. Echo made sad whimpering sounds that cut through David's heart like knives. He spent hours searching the galactic network for information about dragon nutrition. Most files were locked behind expensive paywalls or restricted by the Draconic Council. What little he found was generic and often contradictory. One source said dragons needed high calcium. Another said too much calcium would kill them. In desperation, David posted a message on a human network forum explaining his situation. The responses came in quickly. Some people called him crazy. Others offered useless advice. But a few messages stood out. A former veterinarian from Earth suggested trying small insects and mixing different protein sources. A xenobiology student recommended checking the temperature of the food, not just the room. An animal handler who had worked with reptiles back home explained that young dragons might need their food partially digested first. David tried everything. He heated the meat to body temperature. He mixed it with crushed supplements and a bit of the ship's vitamin paste. He cut it into tiny pieces that the hatchlings could swallow easily. Patch ate first, cautiously tasting the mixture before taking a full bite. Then Ash joined her, then Silk. Bit needed encouragement, but eventually he ate too. Echo waited until David placed food directly in front of her, letting her smell it first. They kept it down. For the first time in 3 days, the hatchlings had a proper meal. David nearly cried with relief. Over the following days, he began to understand them better. Patch was brave and always tried new things first. She used her tail to balance when her twisted wing made her wobble, and she could actually glide short distances by adjusting her body position. Bit was incredibly fast despite his size, darting around the cargo bay so quickly that David lost track of him. Silk's soft scales made her sensitive to every vibration and air current. She could feel David approaching before he entered the bay. Ash's smoke was not fire, but it was thick and heavy, filling the space around him like a defensive cloud. Echo navigated perfectly by sound, clicking her tongue and listening to the echoes bouncing off the walls. They were not broken. They were different, and their differences made them amazing. David received a message on the 4th day from Dr. Patricia Webb, a xenobiologist who had seen his forum post. She warned him about something important: dragon hatchlings imprint on whoever cares for them in their first weeks of life. The bond goes deeper than simple pet ownership. If they survived, they would consider David family forever. She also mentioned that dragons live for centuries and grow to enormous sizes. Even defective dragons would eventually be larger than most spacecraft. David was not just caring for babies. He was committing to beings who would outlive him and everyone he knew. That night, David sat in the cargo bay with all 5 hatchlings. They had grown noticeably in just 4 days. Their movements were stronger. Their eyes were brighter. Bit crawled into David's lap and fell asleep, his small body warm and trusting. David felt the weight of what he had done settle over him like a blanket. These creatures trusted him completely. They did not know they were supposed to be dead. They did not know the galaxy had rejected them. They only knew that David had chosen them when no one else would. He made a promise in the quiet darkness of the cargo bay. He would find them a safe place. He would protect them. He would make sure they had lives worth living. The ship's navigation system showed 2 more days until they reached Waypoint 7. David had been trying to contact the station's administration for approval to dock with live creatures aboard, but the responses were slow and bureaucratic. Dragons were classified as dangerous megafauna. There were regulations and permits and inspections. Finally, after hours of negotiation and several bribes disguised as expedited processing fees, David received temporary permission to dock in a quarantine bay. He had 2 weeks to find a permanent solution, or the hatchlings would be confiscated by station security. IT was not much, but it was something. On the 6th day, as Waypoint 7 appeared on the view screen, David gathered all 5 hatchlings around him. They were alert and curious, sensing the change in their routine. Patch spread her twisted wing. Bit's tail twitched with excitement. Silk pressed against David's leg. Ash puffed small clouds of smoke. Echo tilted her head, listening to new sounds as the ship prepared for docking. "I do not know what happens next," David told them quietly, "but I promise I will not let anyone take you away. You are safe with me." Patch chirped and rubbed her head against his hand. The others joined in, a tangle of small dragons surrounding their human protector. The ship docked with a metallic clang. David's old life as a simple cargo hauler was over. His new life, whatever it would become, was just beginning. He stood up and headed for the airlock, 5 dragon hatchlings following close behind. Station security escorted David and the hatchlings to Quarantine Bay 7, located in the oldest section of Waypoint 7. The room was designed for biological inspections, not living creatures. White walls reflected harsh overhead lights. The temperature controls were locked at a standard setting that made the hatchlings uncomfortable. There were no soft surfaces, no places to hide, and observation windows on 3 sides where station personnel could watch them like zoo animals. The hatchlings huddled together in the center of the room, overwhelmed by the unfamiliar environment. Guards stood outside the windows, some curious and some disgusted. David heard whispered comments about contamination risks and stupid humans making trouble. He tried to make the space more comfortable. He requisitioned blankets and created a nest in one corner. He adjusted the lighting to be less harsh. He brought in his portable heater to add warmth. The hatchlings gradually relaxed, but David could see the stress in their body language. They were growing fast now, each one the size of a medium dog. The small quarantine bay felt cramped. Word about his situation spread through the human sections of the station faster than a hull breach. By the 2nd day, David started receiving visitors. Doctor Raymond Park arrived first, the station's chief medical officer. He was a serious man in his 50s with gray hair and tired eyes. He examined the hatchlings through the observation window, making notes on his tablet. "I need to inspect them directly," Park said. "Standard quarantine protocols." David hesitated but agreed. Park entered the bay wearing protective gear that made him look like a hazard response team. The hatchlings did not like his appearance. Echo became distressed, unable to identify this strange-smelling intruder by sound alone. She released a burst of compressed air from her throat, a defensive reflex that created a deafening screech in the enclosed space. Park stumbled backward, startled and disoriented. Before David could react, Patch and Bit moved between the doctor and their sister. Their small bodies formed a protective barrier. They were not attacking, just defending. Their message was clear: "Do not hurt our family." Park stood very still. His eyes moved from one hatchling to another, seeing something he had not expected. These were not mindless animals. They showed intelligence, loyalty, and family bonds. They protected each other. He finished his examination quickly and left without issuing a negative report. At the door, he paused and spoke quietly to David. "You have 3 days to figure out your next move. After that, I cannot protect you from station regulations." On the third day, visitors started arriving with offers of help. Anna Rodriguez came first, a hydroponics engineer with kind eyes and dirt under her fingernails. She brought fresh vegetables for David and explained that she had heard his story on the station message boards. "I have a cousin back on Earth who runs a sanctuary for disabled animals," Anna said. "I called her last night. She gave me some advice on what you might need." Anna returned that afternoon with supplies: proper bedding, temperature-regulating mats, nutritional supplements designed for reptilian species, and a list of foods that might work better than what David had been providing. Timothy Chung came next, a maintenance worker who had lost both legs in a mining accident years ago. He moved easily on advanced prosthetics that hummed softly with each step. He stood at the observation window for a long time, watching the hatchlings play. "This station has a community of people like us," Timothy said. "Humans who do not fit in anywhere else. We look after each other. If you need help, you are not alone anymore." More people came. Linda Foster, a teacher who wanted to document the hatchlings' development for educational purposes. Robert Stone, a mechanic who offered to modify David's ship for larger passengers. Grace Liu, an administrator who knew every loophole in station regulations. They gathered in the corridor outside the quarantine bay on the 4th day and formed a plan. David could not keep the hatchlings on the station permanently. The space was too limited, and station authorities would eventually force them to leave. He needed a permanent home for his growing family. Grace had found something: an abandoned research outpost on a moon called Haven's Rest. A mining corporation had built the facility but abandoned it when their mineral surveys came back disappointing. The buildings were still intact. Life support systems still functioned. The location was technically unclaimed territory. The problem was getting there. The route to Haven's Rest passed through space controlled by the Draconic Council. If they discovered David was transporting their former property, they might demand its return or destroy his ship to preserve their breeding program's reputation. "It is a risk," Grace admitted, "but I can forge transit documents. You would be listed as transporting agricultural equipment, not live cargo." Robert added, "I can upgrade your ship's stealth systems. Not military grade, but enough to avoid detailed scans." Anna said, "I will help you gather supplies for the outpost. You will need months of food and materials." Timothy looked at David seriously. "This is your decision, but whatever you choose, we will support you." David thought about it for exactly 3 seconds. The hatchlings needed space to grow. They needed freedom. They needed a real home, not a quarantine bay or the cargo hold of a ship. "We go to Haven's Rest," David said. The human community rallied around him. Over the next 5 days, they modified his ship, installed better environmental controls, and loaded supplies into every available space. They pooled their credits to buy food synthesizers, medical equipment, construction tools, and raw materials. On departure day, 47 humans gathered in the docking bay to see them off. Most had never met David before that week. They came because his story reminded them why humans had joined the galactic community in the first place. To make things better, the hatchlings, now the size of large dogs, pressed against the viewing ports as the ship undocked. They watched Waypoint 7 grow smaller until it disappeared. David sat in the pilot's seat, surrounded by navigation charts and forged documents. He had 29 hours to reach Haven's Rest before his fake clearance codes expired. The journey to their new home began. Draconid space felt different somehow. David knew it was just his imagination, but the stars seemed colder here. His ship, which Grace had jokingly renamed the Second Chance before departure, moved through the outer shipping lanes where patrol activity was supposedly minimal. The hatchlings sensed his tension. Dragons were empathic creatures, responding to the emotions of those they had bonded with. Patch paced the cargo hold restlessly. Echo remained perfectly still, her head tilted as she listened to every sound the ship made. Ash unconsciously released small puffs of smoke that David had to vent before they triggered the ship's fire suppression systems. The first checkpoint came 4 hours into the journey. A Draconid patrol vessel appeared on the scanner, its transponder identifying it as a border security craft. David's heart hammered as he received their hail. Unidentified cargo vessel. Transmit identification and manifest immediately. David sent the forged documents Grace had prepared. His cargo was listed as agricultural equipment and prefabricated housing components. Nothing suspicious, nothing worth a detailed inspection. The Draconid officer who appeared on his screen looked young and bored. He barely glanced at the manifest before waving David through. Proceed on current heading. Welcome to Council Space. The connection closed. David's hands shook on the controls. 3 minutes of conversation that felt like 3 hours. 25 more hours to go. The second checkpoint was not so easy. 12 hours into the journey, a more thorough inspection station ordered David to hold position. The scanner operator had noticed unusual heat signatures in his cargo bay, life signs that did not match the listed cargo. Explain the biological readings from your hold, the inspector demanded. She was older, more experienced, and far more suspicious than the first officer. David had prepared for this. Thermal regulators for the housing units. They sometimes show false positives on bioscanners. It is a known issue with that model. The inspector's eyes narrowed. Hold your position. A boarding team is being dispatched to verify your cargo. David's blood ran cold. If Draconid soldiers boarded his ship, everything ended here. The hatchlings would be discovered. They would be taken back or destroyed. All of it would be for nothing that I in the cargo hold. The hatchlings sensed danger. Silk scales detected the change in the ship's vibration as the engines powered down. Bit's sensitive ears picked up the sound of another vessel approaching. They gathered together, their instincts telling them that predators were near. David made a desperate choice. He activated the emergency maneuvering thrusters and broke away from the inspection station. Alarms screamed through his ship. The patrol vessel immediately gave chase, demanding his surrender. But David was not surrendering. Not now. Not ever. He pushed his engines beyond their recommended limits. Robert's modifications held, but warning lights flashed across every console. The patrol vessel was faster and better armed. Weapons lock alarms added to the chaos of sound. A warning shot streaked past his starboard side, close enough that he felt the impact through the ship's frame. David aimed for a nearby asteroid field, a navigation hazard that appeared on his charts with multiple warning markers. Most pilots avoided it. He was betting his life that he could navigate it better than a military vessel designed for open space combat. The chase became a deadly dance. David weaved between asteroids, using his smaller ship's maneuverability to stay ahead. The patrol vessel fired again. The blast clipped his port stabilizer, and the second chance spun wildly out of control in the cargo hold. The hatchlings were thrown against the walls. Bit yelped in pain. Patch spread her twisted wing instinctively, trying to stabilize herself in the tumbling chaos. The artificial gravity failed for 3 seconds. 3 seconds of weightlessness and terror. David fought the controls, sweat pouring down his face. His training from years of cargo hauling kicked in. He had recovered from worse spins in asteroid mining operations. He could do this. The ship steadied, but fuel was leaking from a ruptured line. The patrol vessel was closing in. David had one chance, a narrow canyon cutting through the largest asteroid in the field. His ship would barely fit. The patrol vessel, being larger, could not follow. He took the canyon at full speed. Metal scraped against rock with a sound like the universe screaming. Sparks flew past the viewports. The ship shuddered so violently that David thought it would tear itself apart. For 5 seconds that stretched into eternity, he was certain they would be crushed between the walls of stone. They emerged on the other side. The patrol vessel tried to circle around, but David was already engaging his jump drive. Jumping this close to a large gravity well was prohibited for good reasons. The risk of mis-jump was enormous. They could end up anywhere. They could end up scattered across multiple dimensions, but staying meant capture. David activated the jump, space bent. Reality twisted. The second chance disappeared from Draconid's sensors. They rematerialized in an empty region far off any navigation routes. David checked his instruments with hands that would not stop shaking. The ship was badly damaged, but functional. They had enough fuel to reach Haven's Rest, but not enough for any mistakes. He stumbled to the cargo hold and found the hatchlings injured but alive. It had a deep cut along his side. Patch's twisted wing had been damaged further. Silk trembled uncontrollably. Ash had burn marks where he slid against hot metal. Echo made distressed clicking sounds. David used his limited medical supplies to treat them. He was not a doctor, but he tried his best. The hatchlings accepted his care without resistance. They understood he had saved them. As David bandaged bits wound, he realized something important. The Draconid Council did not hunt these creatures because they were defective. They hunted them because they were dangerous. Not physically dangerous, but ideologically dangerous. If failures could thrive, if differences could be valued, then everything the Council believed collapsed. David plotted a new course to Haven's Rest, this time avoiding all Draconid space. The journey would take twice as long. Their supplies would barely last, but they would be safe. That night, all 5 hatchlings gathered around David in the damaged cargo hold. They formed a protective circle, keeping their injured human warm. Bit pressed against David's chest. Patch rested her wing across his lap. They were family, bound by survival and choice. David whispered into the darkness, "We are almost home." The moon appeared on the view screen like a promise. Haven's Rest orbited a massive gas giant, its surface covered in rust-colored dust and dark rock formations. The abandoned outpost sat near the equator, a cluster of prefabricated buildings that had been designed to house 50 miners. Now it would house 1 human and 5 dragons. David's landing was rough. The damaged ship came down hard, and one of the landing struts collapsed on impact. The second chance tilted at a sharp angle, alarms blaring as systems struggled to compensate. But they were down. They had made it. The hatchlings, now the size of large dogs, crowded around the cargo bay door. They sensed something different about this place. When David opened the door, they experienced natural atmosphere for the first time in their lives. Wind carried strange scents, mineral dust, thin vegetation, and something like distant rain. The sky stretched overhead, so much larger than any ship's ceiling. 2 suns hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the landing pad. Patch was the first to step outside. She tested her twisted wing in the low gravity and discovered something amazing. She could glide here. The reduced gravity compensated for her malformed wing. She launched herself forward and sailed 20 meters before landing clumsily, but successfully. Her excited chirp echoed across the empty landscape. Bit raced across the landing pad, delighting in the open space. He was faster here than he had ever been on the ship. Silk pressed her soft scales against the ground, feeling vibrations from deep within the moon's geology. Ash experimented with his smoke, watching it drift on the wind in ways it never could in enclosed spaces. Echo tilted her head, processing thousands of new sounds. Wind over rock, distant geological activity, the hum of the outpost systems. David spent the first day making the main habitat building livable. The power grid still connected to solar panels that had collected dust for years. He cleaned them and watched the lights flicker to life throughout the outpost. Water recyclers coughed and sputtered before producing clean water. The heating system worked after David cleared out a nest built by some small native creature. The hatchlings explored their new home with endless curiosity. The habitat building had large rooms that once served as communal spaces for miners. High ceilings gave Patch space to practice gliding. Long corridors let Bit run at full speed. Silk found a quiet room where she could rest against the vibrating floor. Ash discovered that his smoke looked beautiful in the sunlight, streaming through dusty windows. Echo memorized the acoustic properties of every room within hours. David found the outpost's computer system still functional. The files explained everything. A mining company had sought rare minerals, but found deposits too small for profit. They abandoned the facility after 8 months, leaving everything behind. The equipment remained: excavators, processors, and tunneling machines. All functional, but forgotten. Over the following weeks, David established routines. Mornings were for repairs. The outpost had years of neglect to undo. Afternoons were for hunting. The moon supported native life. Small reptilian creatures, insect-like animals, and tough plants that grew in sheltered areas. The hatchlings learned to hunt under David's supervision. Bit discovered he was an excellent hunter. His speed let him catch prey that larger predators would miss. Patch learned to herd prey toward the others by gliding overhead, her shadow driving animals toward waiting jaws. Echo used echolocation to find creatures hiding underground, clicking and listening for the return sounds. Silk could sense approaching prey through ground vibrations long before they came into view. Ash used his smoke to flush animals out of their hiding places. They were a pack. Each member contributed unique abilities. David watched them work together and realized something profound. The Draconid breeding masters had eliminated diversity in favor of uniformity, never understanding that different individuals working together were stronger than identical ones working alone. The hatchlings grew rapidly. Within 2 months, they were the size of horses. Their personalities fully emerged. Patch became the leader, always first to investigate anything new. Bit became the scout, ranging far from the habitat to map their territory. Silk became a caretaker, sensitive to everyone's emotional and physical state. Ash became the entertainer, constantly playing and inventing games. Echo became the thinker, observing before acting. David received messages from Waypoint 7. Anna sent updates about the human community. Timothy forwarded news from the Galactic Network. Grace warned him that the Draconid Council had issued notices about a stolen cargo vessel and missing biological property. They were searching, but they did not know where to look. 3 months after landing, Dr. Patricia Webb sent a request to visit Haven's Rest. She wanted to study the hatchling's development. David was hesitant, but agreed. Expert advice would help. Webb arrived in a small research vessel. She was a tall woman with gray hair and intelligent eyes. She spent a week observing the hatchlings, taking notes, and running gentle tests. At the end of her visit, she shared something that changed everything David thought he knew. These hatchlings are not defective, Webb explained as they watched the dragons play in the late afternoon sun. They are evolutionary variants. Natural dragons would have diversity, some built for different environments, different prey, different survival strategies. The Draconid Council has spent millennia breeding that diversity out, creating standardized war dragons. These hatchlings represent a return to what dragons were before domestication. She explained that each defect was actually an adaptation. Patch's twisted wing allowed tighter maneuverability in enclosed spaces. Its small size meant he needed less food and could survive on fewer resources. Silk's soft scales made her more sensitive and aware of her environment. Ash's smoke was a defensive mechanism that evolved before dragons developed fire breathing. Echo's blindness forced her to develop cognitive abilities that most dragons never used. The Draconid Council destroyed these variants not because they were weak, but because they could not be controlled as easily. They were too independent, too adaptable, too different. Webb left Haven's Rest with her research, promising to publish her findings. She told David he was not just raising dragons, but preserving a genetic legacy that could save the species from its own domestication. That night, David sat outside watching the 5 dragons play in moonlight. They were no longer hatchlings, but juveniles, powerful and graceful. They were his family. He was theirs. They had survived together. David whispered to the stars, "We made it." David woke to Patch's morning call, a deep thrumming sound that vibrated through the habitat building. 1 year had passed since they arrived at Haven's Rest. The dragons were now massive, each the size of a small shuttlecraft. They could no longer fit inside the habitat comfortably, so David had converted the old mining hangars into their sleeping quarters. The outpost had become more than a hiding place. It had become a sanctuary. Word had spread through the human network about Haven's Rest. David received messages from across the galaxy, people asking if he would take in other unwanted creatures, animals rejected for being different, beings deemed unworthy of life by their own species. David said yes more often than he said no. The sanctuary now housed the 5 dragons plus 12 other creatures. A 3-legged predator from Kelver who had been abandoned by her pack. A T-Charwynen who could not join the hive mind because of cognitive differences. A scarred creature from Feliner who had survived laboratory experimentation. Others who had nowhere else to go. David was not alone anymore. Ana Rodriguez had arrived 4 months ago, leaving her job to help run the sanctuary. Timothy Chun visited for month-long stays, using his engineering skills to expand the facilities. Linda Foster recorded everything, creating educational materials. Robert Stone sent supply shipments whenever possible. The sanctuary operated on donations from the human community and sympathetic aliens. It barely broke even, but it worked. The 5 dragons had become the sanctuary's guardians. When new arrivals were frightened or aggressive, the dragons calmed them. Patch's commanding but gentle presence put nervous creatures at ease. Bit's playfulness helped anxious animals relax. Silk's sensitivity allowed her to detect emotional distress before anyone else noticed. Ash created smoke barriers to give frightened creatures privacy. Echo's patience taught others that different abilities were not disabilities. David watched them interact with residents and felt profound pride. These dragons, who were supposed to die within hours of hatching, had become teachers and protectors. But peace could not last forever. 6 months into the 2nd year, Grace Lu sent an urgent message. The Draconid Council had discovered Haven's Rest. They knew what David had been doing. They were sending a delegation to reclaim their property. David had 3 days to prepare. He contacted everyone who had helped him. Humans on Waypoint 7, xenobiologists who had studied his dragons, galactic news services. He told them what was about to happen. The response was overwhelming. Hundreds of humans across dozens of systems pledged support. Several alien species who had also suffered from strict genetic policies offered assistance. Dr. Webb published her research early, providing scientific evidence that the defective dragons were actually valuable genetic variants. The galactic news picked up the story. Images of the sanctuary spread across networks. Dragons playing with disabled aliens, humans caring for abandoned creatures, a community built on the principle that all life had value. Public opinion shifted. The Draconid Council faced criticism from unexpected sources. Questions were raised about their culling practices and treatment of genetic diversity. When the Draconid delegation arrived at Haven's Rest, they found 50 humans standing with David. The delegation was led by breeding Master Corvin, the same individual who had signed the release forms 2 years earlier. Corvin stepped off his ship with 4 armed guards. His eyes swept across the sanctuary, taking in the modified buildings, the various creatures, and the 5 enormous dragons watching from the hangar entrance. "I am here to reclaim council property," Corvin announced. "Return the specimens immediately." David stood his ground. "They're not property. They are individuals. You declare them dead and release them to me. Legally, they do not belong to you." Corvin's scaled face twisted with anger. "They're council genetic material bred over millennia. They cannot be allowed to exist outside control programs." They represent contamination of our species. They represent diversity, David countered. Something your council has been destroying for centuries. The argument escalated. Corvin demanded. David refused. Legal terms were thrown back and forth. The 50 humans stood firm, a wall of solidarity. Then Patch stepped forward. She was enormous now, her wingspan over 30 meters despite the twist that had marked her as defective. She placed herself between David and Corvin, a clear statement of loyalty and protection. The other 4 dragons joined her. Bit, still smaller than his siblings, but no less fierce. Silk, her soft scales catching the sunlight. Ash, smoke drifting from his nostrils. Echo, her blind eyes somehow seeing more than anyone else present. Behind the dragons, the other sanctuary residents emerged. The 3-legged predator limped forward. The T'Char-YNN moved with jerky but determined steps. The scarred feliner stood tall. All the broken, rejected, unwanted creatures of the sanctuary united in defiance. Corvin stared at the scene before him. These creatures were not just surviving. They were thriving. They were happy. They were free. They were everything his perfect, standardized dragons were not. Something shifted in his expression. Not acceptance, but doubt. David offered him a choice. Fight to reclaim creatures who do not want to return, or acknowledge that your way is not the only way. Let them live. The silence stretched. Corvin's guards waited for orders. The sanctuary residents held their ground. David's heart hammered. Finally, Corvin spoke. The council will not pursue this matter further, but any attempt to breed these specimens will be considered an act of aggression. David nodded. They will not be bred. This was never about creating more dragons. It was about giving these 5 a life worth living. Corvin returned to his ship without another word. As the draconid vessels departed, the sanctuary erupted in celebration. It was not a complete victory. The council still practiced culling. Other species still destroyed their imperfect young. But here, on this small moon, there was a place where being different was not a death sentence. That night, David sat with the 5 dragons. Patch rested her massive head on his shoulder. Bit curled around his feet. Silk hummed a frequency that David felt in his bones. Ash created smoke patterns in the moonlight. Echo simply sat close. David remembered the moment in the breeding facility when he said those 4 simple words. I will take them. That he looked at the sanctuary lights shining in the darkness and made a new promise. For every creature the galaxy rejected, there would be someone willing to say, I will take them. Haven's Rest had earned its name.